I believe Mark White to be sincere in wishing he had more time to give to minority tastes, but like Tony Blackburn, like most people connected with the channel, he seemed to accept as inevitable and indeed desirable that the raison d'etre for Radio 1 is supply and demand based for the most part on the presumed tastes of the lowest common denominator. One who doesn't hold this view is John Walters, who produces John Peel's Top Gear show. John Walters' view is that pop can be and should be more than oral wallpaper, at least for some of the time.
In some ways, what's wrong with Radio 1 was the way in which it was marketed in the first place. In that I was just coming into radio at that time from the pop music business. And my impression, in the same way that I think most people got the impression, that it was going to be, in some way, a substitute for the Pirates. It was going to be a pop station with a capital P.
Yes.
And you see what I mean? There seems to be a sort of rather a paradox there in thinking at the top. They're not quite sure, to me, whether they want it to be a pop station or whether they want it to be a popular station.
Yes, and it seems to have... It started off with rather a bang, as a straight imitation of the Pirates, and it still retains certain absurd conventions. For instance, it has the jingles, but the jingles are simply advertising the program. It's a sort of extraordinary chicken and egg situation where you get these jingles interrupting the program, and in fact they're interrupted in order to say how good it is.
Yes. They're not sure whether they want it to be an acceptable radio station to pop people, so that the pop papers will give it good write-ups and the musicians will think it's groovy, or whatever musicians are now saying, or whether they want to get figures with the Batley Working Men's Club Golden Mile audience.
But the general feeling I get is that Radio 2 aims more at a sort of straight middle-aged audience, and Radio 1 aims at teenagers. But it seems to aim almost exclusively at a special type of teenager, a sort of bubblegum-chewing girl of about 13 with a transistor next to her ear, sort of jiggling along the street.
And I do think that this is also reflected certainly in the music that comes out, in that there isn't a program, and this certainly includes Top Gear, devoted to good records. And it seems to me that Radio 1 is creating a market for records which are only suitable for Radio 1, in the sense that companies attempted to produce something like Sugar, Sugar, Honey, Honey, Knock 3 times on the Ceiling If You Want Me kind of records, which a producer will listen to and say, great, that's a Radio 1 record, it's short, bright, bouncy.
What's so refreshing to an outsider listening to Top Gear, which one finds on practically no other program on Radio 1 at all, is that Peel's approach to the music, while not without the odd joke and so on, has none of that formula, rapid, jokey style that most of the disc jockeys go in for. I mean, he does make his points easily, but in the sort of way that you'd expect music to be introduced on Radio 3 even. I mean, he introduces it, says what he has to say about it. But his presentation's serious in a sense.
Talking of a more serious content, of course, in the way that John presents the show, it's difficult to say. I mean, to what extent should a disc jockey be serious? Is it his job to be serious? And I'm pretty keen on the idea that disc jockeys shouldn't come over with a lot of personal opinions on things. But when I first started on Top Gear, I remember John Peel was taken to task at that time for making remarks about current events and of political nature and so on, and was told that Radio 1 was not the correct place for serious discussion. And I thought, well, if they apply this right away along the line, I'd be quite satisfied with this. But I was in a studio only a few months ago, and you were on the platform with Jimmy Savile doing a speakeasy, when Jimmy took a vote among the studio audience at the Paris studio on the existence of God. Can you remember that?
I do remember it only too well. Yeah, I was thinking of it while you were saying that.
Exactly.
So
I wouldn't mind if we were held back on what John could say if this went right the way along the line, and there was no supposedly serious comment.
But Speakeasy is a typical example of, in my view, of how serious comment is allowed as long as the people conducting that serious comment have a more or less establishment view.
I like to think that Top Gear is... I don't think Lord Reith would approve of Top Gear, or probably the whole of Radio 1. But I like to think that Top Gear is maintaining that sort of three-pronged policy in the original corporation charter, that radio was intended for, what was it again, education, entertainment and information. And we are one of the few programmes, I think, certainly on that light entertainment end, that do provide all three.
That point about comment or controversy on Radio 1 is an interesting one. Not only Peel, but Kenny Everett also have been in trouble for intruding their views on subjects outside their brief. And the general view seems to be that there's no room for political or social comment on the channel. Well, up until now, I've talked only to people who work within the corporation, and I thought it might be valuable to balance this picture by discussing pop on radio with an informed outsider. Who better than Derek Taylor, the Beatles' PRO from their beginning and during their golden years? He then worked for Apple and has recently moved to another large recording company. Derek is by no means the usual frenetic, trendy figure one tends to think of as typical of his métier. How I asked him, did he view Radio 1 as it is?
I don't know what Radio 1 is. It isn't really popular music. It isn't the charts. It isn't John Peel. It really is all sorts of things. And it merges with Radio 2, which I've never been able to understand. But since the BBC can be trusted to market something good and something real, that they could have a go at 24-hour rock and roll radio with traffic hour broadcasts, then the morning show, the lunchtime show, the afternoon traffic hour, whatever it's called, an evening, and then through from midnight till dawn, when a man like Peel could really swing with not only with his music, but with his views and his comment and a few readings. My goodness, the things that Peel could do between midnight and 6 are nobody's business.
But what about Radio 2? I mean, in fact, you like listening to that rather better, don't you?
No, I don't like listening to it rather better, but I know what to expect. I mean, if I want Radio 2, I get Radio 2.
It seems preserved in aspect from some other age.
Yes.
Those late night shows, for instance, one really is sort of back in the 30s with tennis flannels and people drinking gin. One gets that sort of feeling about them.
I think we really can. And Peel can, and Everett can, and all sorts of people we've never heard of can be trusted more. That bright, young, dangerous entrepreneurs can be trusted with broadcasting to a far greater extent than they are.
One of the signs of being alive is to make mistakes.
Yes, and to introduce that tension, that danger of Everett, and the danger of giggling and all that. I don't know what I'm talking about, which he would say sometimes. Then you'd have silence, and then you'd have gabbling. But if you follow Kenny Everett through all his parentheses and asides and lunacy, the man was a broadcaster. Blackburn is allowed to stumble. He's allowed to be frivolous. He's allowed to make mistakes, because they're never going to put anyone uptight. They're never going to write in from Bognor objecting to Tony Blackburn.
No. In fact, it's not the stumbling and the parenthesis and the stuttering.
It's the content of those mistakes.
Yes. But this is never stressed. With the coming of commercial radio next year, Radio 1 can move one of two ways. It can either imitate its rivals and chase the ratings, the way that BBC television has tended to do, or it could take the opportunity to allow the young lions of pop culture their heads. I wish I thought there was a chance for the latter.